Welcome back to Liminal Frames. This is episode 4 of the show, and we are super glad to have you listening with us. We hope that you have a coffee or tea or a beverage of your choice and are here to enjoy this conversation. We don't take for granted that you are listening to us and participating with us in this journey. I'm your host, Nathan, and I am joined by my co-host, ExoAcademian. Exo, how you doing?
I'm doing quite well, thank you. And looking forward to digging into a topic that's bigger than we can possibly handle in 90 minutes, but we'll give it a shot.
I think we're going to solve it. I'm pretty confident we'll just crack this code today.
We'll be done. This will be the total synthesis.
Many have tried. All have failed. Yes. So the topic for today's show is on disclosure and what that means. So no small topic at all. We will do our best to cover as much as we can in this hour and a half. But like all our shows, we're hoping that this sparks additional conversation. We're hoping that this gets you thinking and gets you to want to participate. I can say for me personally, one of the things I enjoy the most about our show and our audience is reading the comments that people leave on YouTube about the show or seeing what people say about it on Twitter. We read every single one of those things. We think about them, and we very much want to incorporate, audience questions and thoughts into the shows that we're doing. So looking forward to hearing what people say about this one as well. So, Exo, disclosure, capital D disclosure. Let's unpack this a little bit. Where do we even start with this? What's a good place to begin if we were to kick this off?
Well, just what you said there made me think that it's helpful to distinguish capital D disclosure from small d disclosure. When we say capital D, I think we mean like world changing, BC and AD kind of thing. It's like after disclosure. In fact, I think Richard Dolan did a book playing on that. The notion that the world will be changed forever. Our civilization will never be the same once this is acknowledged publicly that we are not alone, that we are being visited by others, and perhaps even more so, they've been interacting with us, perhaps even shaping our civilization, what have you. It's a huge topic. I think it's important to get into because many people have different assumptions about it. Some people are convinced that the government knows a lot and maybe even are only holding back because they want to retain their power over society, kind of like a Marxist kind of perspective, Mm-hmm. And so the weak people don't get to hear about it, and they know everything from that perspective down to this is so complex and so paradigm shattering that even the government doesn't really know what's going on. And what they're most terrified about is the public learning about this and then realizing they don't really know how to handle it or stop it or respond to it either. So that's a huge spectrum. And we'll get into where we think things really stand. But that's an interesting perspective to begin on because, again, what people think disclosure entails really depends on the individual.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, what you said right there just made me jump right to the fact that, we cannot take ourselves out of the world in which we live. We are grounded in a world that is incredibly large, that is highly interconnected. There are many geopolitical forces at work in all of our lives that have an influence over how we live from day to day. And it's not being hyperbolic to say that these state actors, of which we are a part, have information and knowledge that we don't have. This is just a fact. And so it's not too hard for us to see why people would jump from that truth, which I think we can all agree on, to these other sort of grander kind of conspiratorial thoughts about how much they know and why they would keep it secret. And as you mentioned, this exertion of control over the population, because a dumb population is just more docile and easy to wrangle. That's in and of itself a very sort of nice and neat and tidy narrative about state power that I think we've been born into. We've inherited that, and that's kind of the landscape that we find ourselves. So one of the reasons why I want to tackle this topic is really, I think, to try to expose some of these notions generally, because examining them and walking through their implications kind of takes away some of their overt power. That there's this notion that we're all just kind of led along by this great big, nanny state or whatever. And as just one example, and by holding that out and saying, well, is that really the case? Is it really the case that there's this, sort of highly coordinated cabal of evil leaders that are, doing X, Y, Z, when we know that many governments are composed of our neighbors and their children, and it's much more complicated than that. So that's one of the ways that I look at this as an opportunity for us to kind of lay bare some of these assumptions that we have about who's in control or who has information, and really ask ourselves, is that right? Is that really how it is? Are these assumptions fair to place on top of these government actors?
Yeah, good point. And I think, we should probably start with talking about that. What do we mean by the government, right? When we say, what does the government know? First of all, when we say the UFO phenomenon, right? You know how much I am on this thing about probably multiple actors, multiple sources, agendas, etc. Well, in the same way, we can't treat the government as this monolithic term. It's grouped by, like you said, our neighbors coming from a variety of worldviews and backgrounds and perspectives and biases. But also government is full of different organizations. And on top of that, there's a lot of stovepiping that goes on, these sort of siloing of information where one group won't necessarily know what another group knows. And that's especially in the top secret world. And that's done for security reasons, that you are more likely to be able to hold on to secrets and not have your adversaries, we're talking geopolitically, get access to information when you're really careful about compartmentalizing it. But the challenge with that also is it becomes difficult with a topic as complex as the UFO phenomenon and high strangeness and paranormality. Something as complex as that, it gets very difficult to make sense of it when you've got these little silos of information that have little bits of the data, but not all of it. And on top of that, you just get, standard red tape bureaucracy. We all know what it's like to go to the DMV and try to get anything done in a timely manner. We sometimes forget that that's the government too. Right? When we say the government, DMV is the government, right? So a lot of it is some people that are not paid terribly well, that are overworked, that feel underappreciated. And on top of that, they exist in these silos, and on top of that, another challenge is we hear about some of the secrets have been moved into the private sector, right? And so when we say, what does the government know? Sometimes what we're really saying is, what did the government know at some point, and then pass it off to the private sector? Because as we've learned, those of us who've looked into this, some of the people in the private sector, researchers there, have higher security clearances than the people supposedly in governmental positions. So perhaps the secret keepers are in those places. And that's why I say, what do we mean by the government? Because some of the really deep secrets and the highest degree of knowledge might be in those private corporations. Even Hal Puthoff in his recent discussion with Eric Weinstein talked about that, that yes, there are even perhaps scientific breakthroughs that exist only in private corporations, which should make our blood boil. Seems like capitalism run amok, but that may very well be the case for a lot of these matters.
Yeah, definitely. And I also want to look at this from the standpoint of, sort of responsibilities, and just have a mature conversation about that perspective as well. So, if you're a parent, if you have children, if you ever worked with children in any way, you recognize that being the adult in that relationship, you have some sort of default responsibilities to ensure that those children, don't harm themselves, that they, don't harm each other, and as much as we don't like to use this as an example, as a metaphor for the state, it's just a fact that we have organized ourselves in this way We have moved beyond sort of our small tribal collective situation, and we've aggregated into these much larger units that they themselves have their own sort of structures and systems and desires, if you will, and self-perpetuating systems. That these things have a responsibility, even though it is not situated in a singular kind of agency, like I have a responsibility over my children, but these institutions have a responsibility to care for the citizenry of which they are in charge, and that is just a fact, whether we like it or not. That's the world in which we live, and I think one of the alluring things about this push for disclosure is this underlying drive to dismantle that construct itself. To say, I am no longer going to be, sort of kept in the dark. We are going to flatten the pyramid. We are going to give everyone the information. All will be transparent. All will be known. And I will not be treated like a child any longer. And I think while that feels very good, and I think as a thinking adult, it's like, yes, I should be justified in wanting that. At the same time, I think we have to be very honest with ourselves that in order to live in a world that is not all on the same page, that there are just different, distinct societies with different aims. We rely on our governments to act in our interests. Do those actions always align with our interests? No, absolutely not. But we do rely on them to act in our interests for the most part, so that our way of living in society continues. And that plays a role in this conversation, and it has to.
I totally agree, and I think we can get into in a little bit what we actually think they know. But I agree with you that it is a complex matter, because not only do they have this sense of responsibility, but we have kind of laid that onto them as well. Like, we might not be conscious of that all the time, not cognizant of it, but really we're like, we want progress, we want truth, but don't take away my 2 cars, don't take away my 4-bedroom house, don't take away my job, don't change what's going to be available in the supermarket. Like, we want this smooth functioning capitalist system that's based on, oil to a large degree still, that kind of thing. A petroleum economy. We on the one hand, we recognize that with global warming and whatnot, there are some major concerns, and we need, a really robust response. That movie that came out recently, Don't Look Up, kind of talks about that, just how both society and our leaders are kind of, implicit, are complicit in this inability to come up with solutions. But we are also part of the problem, because we are implicitly saying, give us truth, but not too much truth, not so much that it undermines the structure and the stability of our system. And yet some of what we're talking about here is completely destabilizing. Forget about, religions and spiritual takes on this, and angels and demons, like we talked about last time, and people who will look at it from that perspective. Just from a geopolitical, economic perspective, a lot of our infrastructure will be undermined by this, depending on what the truth is, right? And we can get into that. But I think it's a good point to start here by saying that this is more complex than some people give it credit for, and that it's worth at least asking, what kind of secrets would you think you would agree would be justifiable to keep secret? In other words, are there any things that if they came out, and some people really do know, some really deeply destabilizing aspects about this matter, not just in terms of aliens, but I mean reality itself being not what we have been taught it is, right? And that if that's what this is pointing towards. In other words, are there any kind of implications, or even the fact that, maybe if the public knows about it, that also is more likely to create a negative scenario, right? A negative outcome. In other words, is it sometimes justifiable to hold back truth because of what the implication will be if you let it out? And the last thing I'll say before I toss it back to you is that, like you say, the world is a place with many different kinds of people, Not everyone's working at the same developmental level. Not every nation state is working at the same developmental level. You want to be careful to not let a warlord get his hands on an anti-grav machine, or energy that could be turned into a device that could, destroy the fabric of reality or something like that. In other words, it is worth thinking, what kinds of truths would you consider justifiable to keep secret? We have to ask that if we're going to talk about disclosure.
Yeah, and what's the spectrum here of revelation? And I like that word. I want to come back to that word again later on. But when I think about this topic, I think about kind of very simple elements of disclosure and very complex elements. On the simple end, it's just, hey, we're not alone. We're essentially there already. I think most of our scientific community, the consensus is, yeah, we're probably not alone in the universe. There's some other kind of life out there. The numbers are just too high. So I would posit that side of the spectrum, we're actually already there. We're actually, but where we aren't perhaps is the very next level above that, which would be, we're not alone and they're already here. They're, whatever they are, they have visited here or they're here now. They're not as far away in the vast universe as we once thought. So that would be kind of what I would think would be the very next step in a slow roll on this spectrum. And then you have the complex end disclosure that gets into really all of the details. And we've talked about this a lot. If you are trying to teach or convey information that is going to impact the mental space of every living person on the planet, you have to do that in a responsible way. You can't necessarily just go immediately to the litany of complex things that we might know and say, okay, hey, here you go. Here's the giant novel that explains everything that we know. Good luck processing that. Get back to us with questions. It's not going to think that it could roll out like that. To me, would be incredibly dangerous. Although it would be very, scintillating. Oh, great! We get all these great answers. But what then? And who all can handle it? Even those who I think have told themselves that they are ready for that level of detail probably aren't, because it's very likely, and you've done a great job pointing this out on Point of Convergence, it's very likely stranger and more diverse than we can assume or imagine. And so I think that if I were to kind of put it on that spectrum and put up some guardrails there, that's sort of how I think about this. I don't know if you think about that in the same way. And is there a kind of necessity to building off of these things sequentially, or do you think there is merit to kind of jumping headfirst into the deep end?
Well, I think a big part of the challenge is the second option presumes that there's consensus amongst the secret keepers about what those secrets are. I do think that what is most terrifying to any government, any group in power, is to have to acknowledge something that is more sophisticated, so much so that you don't even understand how it's doing some of the things it's doing. You don't even understand fully what those things are. You sort of see as an after effect ways that our reality has changed. But it's terrifying to you to have to admit that and have no solutions. It's sort of implicit in the American Constitution that our government is supposed to protect us from all threats, domestic and foreign. And this is on a whole new level. And to a government, what would be the point in admitting this and at the same time not having any ability to respond to it in a way that can control the outcome? That's, so there's getting back to the responsibility piece. You don't want to terrify people. You don't want to terrorize your own populace by admitting something is in our midst that you have no control over. You can't, make them take their shoes off at the border and and search them. It doesn't work that way. They can materialize in your room in the middle of the night, right?
Mm.
Think about that for a second. Think about how we had to wrestle with, in a post 9/11 world, how do we secure our borders? And then you go and you admit to the populace that there's these other beings that can materialize in your room in the middle of the night. They can take you to other realms, and the government has no ability to predict it, to stop it, to respond to it at all. I mean, to many people, that would produce terror. It would be a very destabilizing truth to come out. So I think it's a legitimate concern that if you did know that, but that you were in the process of hoping you could learn more so that you could come up with some sort of response, that you would hold off on letting that information out, because that information would be destabilizing. It would be very concerning to people. It's certainly, when you think about the small details that can crash the markets, because it's driven by fear and greed, right? Is the famous saying. So imagine, how the New York Stock Exchange opens on a Monday following a weekend disclosure that, non-human sophisticated intelligence is here and taking people and, all the pieces we know that are part of this narrative. And imagine how that doesn't completely destabilize the economy and everything else. And so again, it's a complex matter. And you, for me anyway, I can certainly, on the one hand, the cynic in me says the government doesn't want to admit they have no control because they want to maintain control. On the other hand, like you said, we do pass off to them that role so that we can have a stable economy and we can have the lives we want. We watch the Super Bowl on a Sunday. Mm-hmm. So what happens to our analysis of that when suddenly the truth, the disclosure, capital D, means the completely unraveling of society as we know it?
Yeah. And I would quite frankly be upset if they didn't take the time to reflect on how best to reveal this information if they had the ability to do so. So like it would be a complete dereliction of their duty to their citizens and to the world to just say, oh, hey, we just learned this yesterday. We haven't really thought much about it. Here you go. I just don't think that would do anyone any favors at all. It's the same thing. I keep coming back to this parenting metaphor because I am a parent and I think it's just easy to relate to. But, anything that impacts the family, as a collective, the parents generally are going to have a conversation about how to communicate that, whatever it is, to their children. Because the children don't have an awareness yet of the complexity of the world. They don't have the life experience. It's not even a matter of breaking it down for them. I could break it down all day long to my kids. They have not lived enough to have any correlates by which to understand what I'm saying to them. And so, I would be pretty upset with our government if they got information all of a sudden and didn't spend any amount of time in their scientific circles, in their philosophical circles, looking at this from a lot of different angles and saying, okay, we think this is the best way to explain what we have seen and discovered.
Right. And then to use your analogy, imagine that the parental unit completely disagrees about what the nature of the issue is, right? Mm-hmm. So it's one thing when you have two parents who have the same perspective, and then they have to think about how we're going to translate this in kids speak so that, we don't tell our kids the literal truth. We tell them enough that they can move forward based on where they're at and what they can understand, like you said. But there are some people, again, getting back to what we discussed last time with angels and demons and the Collins elite, there are some groups within the government that are convinced that this is demonic activity and that your only response to it should be to not talk about it, to shut it down, that by even talking about it, you give it more power. And that's the worst thing you can do. So again, imagine that in a parental unit kind of situation where one parent is convinced that sure, we have to translate it, but we have to tell our kids something, right? And the other parent says, no, to even let them know this is more damaging than to not. So that gives you again, that's just a small analogy missing all sorts of nuance. But in that alone, you realize how complex this becomes.
Absolutely. Yeah. I resonate with every perspective on this. I resonate with people that get really upset about this, that, the government knows something or knew something decades ago, and they were about to say something about it, and then they didn't. And I'm fired up about this, and I think we should hold them accountable. We should put them on trial even, and get some justice for that. And I resonate from the other perspective that, maybe they did do the right thing. Maybe if we had been in their shoes and we had seen what they'd seen, whatever it is, that we may have made pretty similar decisions. It's all hindsight's always 20, easy to kind of second guess things that have happened in the past, but it could very well be that the right choices were made all along. I can tell you one thing for sure: no matter what is revealed and disclosed, because we've seen this already, no matter what is shared, there will be dispute about it. There will be questions. There will be the cynics and those who are optimistic, and then we'll be fighting over it as well. So I think that's inevitable.
Totally true. I mean, and before we even get there, I was just thinking about what you just said, and I think it's a great point that we have to remember when we think back over the 70 to 80 years of lies, right? We have to frame that again based on what we do on this show a lot within the sociological, geopolitical context of the 20th century. So, in the midst of the Cold War, right, when you're fighting this massive battle for the future of civilization, is the way you see it, right? Where both sides is convinced the other is the arch enemy, and everything bad you can imagine gets ascribed to them on both sides. So supposedly the narrative is that craft and potentially occupants, were discovered in the midst of this. In the midst of a Cold War, right? In the midst of this epic battle of civilizations for the future, economic structure, socio-political structure of the entire world, right? Both sides were trying to take over countries, annex countries to create these huge pacts right around the world. So you can't separate disclosure from that context. That was the context. And if you really feel like, regardless of whether or not they're right, but if you're convinced that you're on the good side and you're trying to prevent this other, geopolitical system from taking over and doing evil, then you may say, yes, this is a huge revelation. People would want to know about this, but now is not the time. We're fighting this war. We just don't have the bandwidth to also analyze this and make sense of this. So it gets put on the back burner. So we've before talked about, ironically, the very advent of the atomic age may have been the, created the inception point for this, some of these intelligences to come into our midst, to come into our realm, to interact with us. So it might have been in the midst of this Cold War that caused some of the uptick in them being here and interacting with us. But, if you're one of those secret keepers, you're also trying to, in the midst of this, win this Cold War of massive proportions. So we absolutely have to keep that in mind. And I agree with you. It's I think one thing we try to do on this show is, again, take that multi-perspectival view where we can see it from different points of view and try to, and we encourage people to do this, to try to see it from someone else's point of view. And only when you really stand in their shoes can you maybe see how there's some validity to that. So I understand, like you said, that some people are frustrated that the lies, the changing stories about Roswell were ridiculous. Like, just on the face of it, just ridiculous. No, and the weather balloon and swamp gas kind of Venus, all these sort of jokes we make now because we felt belittled that the government would say, oh, you're just mistaking this object that split into three and moved up and down and abducted you and put you back, and that was just actually Venus. Like something so static, and to mock people's intelligence that they wouldn't be able to distinguish the planet Venus, from this bizarre, array of experience they went through. Again, that part I am totally sympathetic to. That there are points along the trajectory where there was cover-ups, where there was a deliberate, beyond just cover-up, there was also deliberate programs put into place to stigmatize this topic, to even do, if not just financial or professional harm to people, even maybe more than that. We're talking about even lethal force potentially being used to keep this secret under wraps. There's hard to pin down exactly what happened, but certainly there was major stigma. Some people lost their lives because they were, fed disinformation and it became too much for them. A lot of, the historical narrative is difficult to justify, certainly. So we have to, in some ways, I think, to make sense of this very big topic, not try to not take it in one global, spoonful. The Roswell stuff, that is certainly frustrating. That certainly was not justified. It was ridiculous. It was belittling to people. It created this sense in people's minds that the government is the enemy, that the government are holding back information that every human being has a right to know. They have no right to do this. I understand all of those concerns. And then, I think when we get into the later 20th century and into the 21st century, then it becomes a different matter. So, and like you said, there's different responses. Some people want to, see these people hang, they have no, patience for it, no grace for it. Other people are more pragmatic and they say, perhaps we should offer amnesty to the secret keepers, to saying, you come out, you tell us what you know on a congressional level or whatever, and then the public hears it after that. We're willing to grant you amnesty that you won't be, convicted of crimes for these secrets. And then people wrestle with, is that worth it? Are we willing to let them off if it means we finally get the truth? And that in itself is a complex question.
Yes. Well, as we kind of switch over to speculating about what might be known, there are, in the literature, there's a sort of a spectrum of things that have been talked about that the government may be aware of. And why don't we start? We got to start somewhere. Why don't we start here with this notion that we may be in possession of material or craft? Do you kind of, when you're looking at things in the research that you have done, do you feel like that's pretty safe ground to land on, for lack of a better phrase? Do you think that we at least have something there in a laboratory or something?
Yes, absolutely. I think that there is plenty of evidence to suggest we have material that looks to be debris from craft and whatnot. You have people like Eric Davis, who know as much as anyone on this. I talked about him on my most recent podcast on Point of Convergence. He's a straight shooter. He doesn't make stuff up. He's sometimes a controversial figure, but he's always a straight shooter, and he's made it clear that he's analyzed stuff that we don't know how to make. Some of these materials are not necessarily initially obvious to us what they do, but they clearly look exotic. They are in an amalgam of materials that we don't know how to put together in that way, or if we did, it would be extremely expensive. And on top of that, there were times where we had no idea what it would even do once you did create it. And yet, very interestingly, sometimes after decades, we will finally have an aha moment and say, aha, you could levitate something. If you, project the right amount of energy at a certain terahertz frequency, then that thing is going to float, stuff like that. And you go, wow, that is fascinating. But yes, to answer your original question, I do think we very clearly have material that's probably from craft. But I will say, before I hand it back over to you, but what that ultimately means is a separate question. I don't want to jump to, that means they're ETs, coming from a different galaxy and they've crashed their craft because they had a bad day, like we talked about before. We've discussed before the whole question of, are these deliberate crashes in quotes, meaning that they're there either to be gifts to help us discover new technology, or some sort of coded message to say, hey, stop detonating atomic bombs. What it means is a different question, but have they recovered material that seems to be highly sophisticated and not something we could easily or at all create? Yes, I believe that's true.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think we see other pieces of evidence that point in that direction as well. Most recently, I can think of Ross Coulthard's excellent book, In Plain Sight, where he talks about his conversations with Nat Kobitz, and Nat mentioning that, that we did have something that we were trying to reverse engineer, pretty strongly hinting that we were in possession of some sort of material or craft or part of a craft, secreted away, potentially in a private industry, for example. So that's a good recent example. And then I can think too, we've already talked about Roswell, so that's a iconic story, of course. But and I'll go. It's controversial, but I'll go with another controversial one, which is Bob Lazar. A very heated kind of topic there. Lots of different opinions on that. I'm not here to say one way or the other, but certainly that story, has fanned the flames that we are in possession of something. And then there are other anecdotes of crashes. Recently, Jacques Vallée, in his book with Paula Harris on Trinity, the crash there. And then I can think of the Aztec crash in Aztec, New Mexico, I think it was. So a very well-known case. So there are a lot of sort of interesting things that we can look at in the literature that seem to strongly hint that there is a there. And then I would also point to the passage of the Gillibrand Amendment from the NDAA, and the explicit mention of retrieving teams specifically set up to go and retrieve something. Now we can talk about that in the prosaic sort of auspices of retrieving a downed drone of some kind and getting our hands on that technology and understanding it. Maybe it's from one of our adversaries, but it could also hint at something else. And that's, of course, a lot of conjecture. So we're going to have to kind of wait and see as this story continues to unfold, what really may be at play there. But if you kind of add all these things together, along with many different accounts over the decades, I would say there's some pretty good evidence here to say that there is some that we are in possession of something. And that the narrative we always hear is that we've got it and we don't know what to do with it. We kind of like play around with it for a while, throw some science at it, and throw our hands up in the air and come back a decade later and try again.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting when you think about the Gillibrand Amendment, and it's amazing how different people will look at that and come away with different conclusions about what it means, right? But you could easily argue, why would you even have that aspect about crash retrieval teams if there was no there, right? If we were still at the level of total conjecture about even if anything's happening, if it's just atmospheric phenomena or whatever, why would you actually go so far as to plan that kind of detail, right? Mm-hmm. And yeah, some people who are skeptics will just go, like you said, it's just recovering drone technology, right? That's become the sort of the catch-all. It was weather balloons in the 40s, and now it's drones, right? It's this sort of like excuse point we introduce. And yeah, the Bob Lazar point, you went there, so I'll go there too. It is controversial. You get people who have really strong opinions on both sides and everything in between. I think what I noticed was some people in general is that they tend to have black or white views. So they say, look, there's clearly some things about Bob Lazar that don't add up. Therefore, I reject his testimony altogether. Mm-hmm. I don't think we can do that. I don't think that any of us have a completely non-checkered past, and we wouldn't want to be judged by everything we've ever said or done. And I, for one, tend to think a lot of the meat of what he said has some validity to it. And it also makes complete sense to me that, like you mentioned, we can bring in all the highly credentialed scientists at first, but if you do that for a decade and you haven't got anywhere, and you get some guy who created rocket engines in his spare time, you might give him a shot because what do you have to lose, right? And so it makes sense to me that when they would try and crack this for years and years and not really get anywhere, that they would try to think outside the box and bring in some other people like a Bob Lazar to make sense of it. That part, of course, is hugely fascinating because that doesn't just mean, if it's true, it doesn't just mean we have some wreckage. It means we actually have either recovered craft that are still mostly operational, or we've known at least enough to try to recreate these vehicles, fully. And I think Bob Lazar's testimony was that there's several different models, right, that they sort of had that he viewed. It's tricky to figure out what's exactly going on, but I think there is a there, regardless of exactly what the specifics are. I think that even when you look at stealth technology, some people will look at it and say, there's nothing really special there. That's something we would have, prosaically come across eventually. Other people who are convinced that the stealth technology came directly out of discoveries we made from retrieved vehicles and retrieved materials. I've heard arguments on both sides of the equation, but I am pretty convinced that we not only have debris, but we probably have perhaps even mostly intact craft, or enough that we could actually try to figure out how the technology works.
Well, and then that gets me to the next item. So what do we think about, and you hinted at it earlier, about the notion of occupants in these craft? There's been some mention of this. I can think of the interview, I believe it was with Kurt Jaimongol and Lou Elizondo, where Elizondo hinted at, kind of biological material, very vague, a broad term there, could mean a whole lot of different things. But there are many other stories, Roswell, another great example that, I forget that there were, a couple of 2 or 3 bodies and maybe one that was still alive. That I've heard that story. Secreted away to Wright-Patterson or something, so there's a lot of talk about this, about some kind of humanoid entities. I wonder to what degree, you think that holds the same amount of water as the craft item.
Yeah, that one feels a bit more speculative. I'm less sure of that, but I think there's enough smoke that there's probably fire there at some point. Again, whether or not those were, a kind of advanced AI, there's even been discussions, I think even in the Trinity book that you mentioned with Harrison Valet, where, there's the discussion of, or at least it's been postulated before, that if these are actually either gifts, meaning, deliberate crashes to try to advance our technology, which you could even argue that's us from the future doing that and try to change the timeline in a way that wouldn't outright reveal that it's technology from your own future. But, the argument has been made that maybe they just used sophisticated semi-organic AI because they wouldn't want to be so cruel as to go and, kamikaze these guys into the desert and kill them, but rather we want to, again, if it's about creating a narrative that this is a spaceship with aliens who flew across the vast stretches of space to get here, then you may bring bodies into it as well, right? So again, there's the details, and there's the interpretation of the details, right? So again, getting back to the Collins Elite again. What I found fascinating when I researched that was that even though they never actually got, from my understanding, firsthand, they never got their hands on the material itself, or they never, saw the bodies, whatever, they still came to some very strong conclusions about what Roswell was. And they were convinced that, yes, material was recovered, but it was the product of demonic alchemy, right? That Satan and his minions can actually manifest 3D objects that we can pick up and hold and go, wow, this looks like technology.
Mm-hmm.
And on top of that, they actually believe that there were biological entities, or what looked like biological entities that were recovered, but they also believe that that too was a kind of Frankenstein kind of alchemy, that these things that look like biological bodies were all part of the ruse to make you believe that narrative about the ETH. So again, and like you said, Elizondo has talked about this, but he's also been very hesitant to put forward the ETH. He brings in, he's very quick to say, maybe there's, humanities, like maybe it's more than just one, or maybe there's other species that have, been alongside us all along. We just haven't perceived them for whatever reason. So he seems very, very eager to postulate those notions, to sort of get that circulating in ufology. So yes, I think that this was a very long answer to a question. But yes, I think there's been biological material recovered. Then the question becomes, what does that material actually represent?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's definitely the one that I think, all of these to me get me very curious, but, certainly a lot of questions follow from this idea that we may have entities, either alive or dead, that we can interact with or study, and what those what that revelation may mean for us. I wonder too, there's just so many topics we can touch on, but another one that kind of came to mind as far as like what the government may know. We know that there has been research done with the Stanford Research Institute, work that Hal Puthoff has done into psi abilities, remote viewing, work that has been done with Uri Geller and Ingo Swann and a bunch of others, Joe McMoneagle, into this notion that human beings themselves have this capability of telekinesis or telepathy, all of the above, and many have speculated that line of research inquiry is in and of itself related to this entire topic, and we've touched on this a little bit before, but how do you see that component as it ties into this grander disclosure picture?
Yeah, it definitely is part of it. As I've mentioned recently, I'm currently working on a book that is going to try to tie all this together, to try to conceive of a metaphysical conception of reality that would give birth to all of these different phenomena we've observed, including psi phenomena amongst human beings, not to mention from these others. It's for sure connected. My personal contention is still that there's different sources, different groups, different agendas here. I think that's part of the huge complexity of disclosure, is that it's not one aha moment. It's that there's numerous bullet points on the disclosure list. So I need to be careful here to constrain what I want to say, but yes, I think that, again, to cynics, they will dismiss that right away and say, come on, psi, really? That's going to be your argument? That shows you how weak your data is. Mm-hmm. And yet I've seen over 100 years of parapsychological research that makes it very, very clear that psi is real. It's not a question anymore. And to the fact that we even have to have that debate still shows me just how much prejudice there is and how much inertia there is behind the physicalist paradigm that doesn't know what to do with that, so it just wants to not talk about it. And it's amazing to me how successful that establishment has been in keeping to the margins any kind of parapsychological research that has arisen, much like the phenomenon research. Mm-hmm. But yes, like you touched on, there have been remote viewers who are remarkably capable, have shown, again, there was a program funded by the CIA at SRI with Hal Puthoff and Russell Targ and people, that ran for 20 years. Okay, it was a fully funded government program that ran for 20 years. You don't fund a program for 20 years if it doesn't produce results. I mean, there are always more programs searching for money in governmental circles than there is money to go around. So at the end of the day, if you're not producing intel that's valuable, especially in the midst of a Cold War, you're going to get axed. But they weren't axed. They were funded for 20 years. And I still think it's still going on. It's probably just buried in the DoD or something. But we know that they were capable of, for instance, producing intel about military infrastructure within the Soviet Union, right? Mm-hmm. We have cases where they provided intel, and what you do with that kind of intel is you try and verify it through other means, and they were able to verify it through other means. So we know that these guys, Joseph McMoneagle being one of them, like you mentioned, was able to see without seeing, right? Mm-hmm. Without using his normal senses, had a vision of these various military infrastructure in the Soviet Union. And later on, they would take a picture when they actually found this thing eventually. And it's remarkable. There's no way you can say that he kind of just guessed. It's something that was not known to exist at the time. Even the military brass didn't know what to do with it because they weren't aware of anything like that. And yet later on, it's verified as true. So I say that to point out that we've already seen that these guys produce valid intel that's been verified elsewhere. So we know they have a talent. We know it really happens. Those same guys, like you mentioned some of them, Uri Geller, McMoneagle, etc., they also have remote viewed, supposedly alien spacecraft, sometimes orbiting the Earth, and sometimes even supposed alien bases, like 4 major ones I remember being described around the Earth in different places. Mm. And it's difficult to discount that because these are the same individuals that produced valid, proven intel elsewhere. And the way that any kind of psi works is that, time and space kind of become irrelevant, and the way that aspect right there is a key part of the book I'm writing in terms of what does that tell us about reality? The fact that we can sometimes perceive events that seem to not exist within space-time at all. What does that tell us about space-time as a construct, as opposed to, the substratum of reality itself? So, yes, I think that we have to look at the remote viewing work, the psi work that's been done, and I think that's another data point that suggests, yes, the aliens are here, whatever they are, right? And again, I think there's more than one source. And likely there are things like not only craft, but now we introduce things like alien bases, and things like that. And there's even been part of the literature that wants to, speculate that perhaps even aspects of the government are in cahoots with some of these others. And, people, sometimes abductees or contactees will report seeing human beings along with things like gray aliens in these bases, right? Not to mention on board supposed spacecraft. So that has led a lot of people to say, aha, not only does the government know that they're here, but they're actually working with them. And they've made these, agreements, these concords to let them abduct people in exchange for technology and those kind of things. That's a whole other ball of wax to get into. But all it is to say, yes, I think psi is real. Psi is a central data point to make sense of the entire phenomenon. And it's something we need to pay attention to in terms of what's actually going on, what the government knows, et cetera.
Yeah, and I want to point out that for our listeners, we're talking about these sort of data points, and as it relates to disclosure, because it points to the complexity of this, just generally, that there's no simple narrative that can just be written down on a one sheet of paper that kind of explains what's happening here. I can think even more recently of a great example of this that in the UFO community got kind of a lukewarm reception, and that's skinwalkers at the Pentagon, talking about OSAP and the work of James Lukatsky and Bob Bigelow with Skinwalker Ranch and the phenomenon that was observed there. Again, a funded program over many years, involving a lot of government professionals, some very highly credentialed people with exceptional backgrounds and security clearances, reporting in this book a range of phenomenon that is, kind of out there, if I were just to be candid. And I think that's part of the reason why it got such a, kind of a, a chilly reception. There's just a lot of stuff in that book that people I think are having a hard time fitting into their notion of disclosure. And we haven't talked about this really explicitly, but that's part of this conversation. There's disclosure as it is, and there's disclosure as I want it to be. And so when you're handed this piece and you're saying, okay, here's a piece for you, it's part of the disclosure narrative, and you're looking at it and going like, well, this isn't going to go into my puzzle. This doesn't fit with what I've already constructed. So this must be bogus. You can't be serious. Like, I'm sorry, you can take this book. I don't need it. I think that's premature. I think over time we're going to find that the information, the evidence, the data that was gathered in that endeavor does point somewhere and is going to be part of the overall story. But I wonder, to what degree have you kind of thought about that, and where does a place like Skinwalker Ranch and all the purported phenomenon that takes place there, where does that fit into this conversation?
Yeah, it's a great point. And I think you raise a really important notion that to some degree you could argue there's been, a slow leak of disclosure already. A book like Skinwalkers at the Pentagon not only got written, but it got approved, right? These are guys that, because they had top secret clearances, Colm Kelleher and Lukatsky and stuff, had to get this like line by line read, and approved. And they could only release for publication what was willing to be released by the government, right? By the authorities they worked for. That tells you something right there, that you could argue that what the government has decided is that the best way to let this out is through slow leaks, and through, there's this notion of, plausible deniability. You release information so that you get into the collective consciousness these notions that this might be going on, right? So you desensitize people to the notion that might be shocking otherwise if you had a presidential address that said it outright. So instead you slowly leak it into the consciousness, right? Into the social spheres and whatnot. So it becomes part of the ongoing conversation, so that when one day you get more direct confirmation, that's what it is. It's more confirmation of what was already kind of in the ethos. Like you, I've been surprised by... So first of all, I want to say none of the weirdness surprises me at all. I think that the research I've done says that absolutely all of that is happening. And what's fascinating there is that they decided that, based on historical research that had already been done by people like Bob Bigelow and his organization with NIDS and whatnot, it had already been shown that these other anomalous phenomena would co-arise with UFOs. So it's a false distinction to say, let's just focus on UFOs, because that'd be like trying to resolve some sort of disease that you're trying to figure out. But you say, we're only going to pay attention to these data points. Even though these other ones keep showing up, we're going to pretend that those don't exist because it's unnerving and doesn't fit with our conventional understanding of reality. No, if you're truly taking a scientific approach, and I, commend these guys for doing exactly that, you say, no, if this is what the data shows us, then we follow it. We don't go in with a presupposition about reality and exclude everything that doesn't fit that. That's not how you should do science. You go in and say, look, this is what we see. We have to rethink. Again, this gets back to what I've been thinking about, is what kind of conception of reality would be such that those kind of phenomena would be predictable, Mm-hmm. And absolutely, Skinwalker Ranch is a really key piece. And it is strange to me that book hasn't had more of an impact. I mean, we're talking about not just people, as much as people complain about anecdotal stories, these are researchers going in with sensor systems and whatnot, people highly credentialed who for the longest time, this is the last thing they would want to be associated with because it's a career killer, right? But thankfully, these guys were, taken with curiosity to say, wait a second, something's going on. We've got objective data. Let's look into it. And yeah, when people hear about 7-foot tall wolf-like creatures smoking cigarettes, leaning up against a light post, standing on two legs, showing up on the other side of the country from Skinwalker Ranch because of some sort of hitchhiker phenomenon that happened, that's really out there, right? Like some people just go, I can't go there. Like, and so they unconsciously just delete that data from their consciousness, right? And say, can we get back to the ETH and confirming that the aliens, are here? No, we can't. We can't do that. And like you've been pointing out, that's why disclosure is so complex, because it's a fundamental rewriting, I'm convinced, of what reality is. And so the way we talk about different people, it means different things to. To me, that's what capital D disclosure ultimately is that the very fabric of reality is not what we thought it was. That how do you disclose that? There's no easy answer. And on top of that, there are plenty of people who look at the same data and not come to that conclusion because they have different presuppositions or different backgrounds or whatever. So it's not even that when you look at, sometimes like even with scientific revolutions, something will be clear in the data, but it'll take decades and decades and decades before it works itself into the mainstream because of the prejudice and the inertia that the current mainstream view has. It's just the nature of the game. For the longest time, the church kind of, set the tone for what reality consisted of. And then it kind of shifted to science, right? And now there's a mainstream view of physicalism as the underlying paradigm, even though there's been evidence for a long time now, especially in quantum mechanics going back 100 years ago, that model is faulty, that it's not even tenable. Not just that it has some holes, it's just not tenable. And yet it's only slowly working its way through the establishment. And usually it takes a lot of funerals, to be honest with you, and generational shifts before that is even capable of happening. So that's why you mentioned it early on in this conversation. This is probably a multi-generational matter if we're talking about really capital D disclosure in terms of what's really involved.
Well, we've talked a good bit about, what the government may know, what the government has studied. There's another component to this as well, and that's the things that we have heard and read and many of us experienced, and that is that personal experience of the phenomenon, of where individuals already have a firsthand, very visceral experience of that fabric of reality being distorted and different than they thought before. And so I think the community, as far as I can tell, really does struggle with that component of this, because, and this speaks to something that I've talked about before, and that's the one aspect of disclosure is how truth itself is mediated in society. So how whatever is given or granted in the public square, through the media, through government channels, etc. Those, if it travels through certain avenues and pathways, it becomes part of the truth that is commonly accepted, becomes part of consensus reality. I'm struggling with the individual experiences and understanding how that can translate onto a stage that would make its way into consensus reality. At the same time, there's kind of this almost like an irony to that, because you and I both know that when you begin having this conversation with people and you open the door to this strangeness, more often than not, you'll find that people have an experience they want to share, or they know someone who did, either in their family or a close friend or whatnot. So there tends to be quite a bit of personal experience that everyone kind of carries with them that they have trouble explaining, and our sort of very highly rational left brain society tends to kind of take those experiences, and we say, that's you were tired, or you had too much to drink, or you were having an episode or whatever it is, you saw a shadow and that was just a tree or something, like we try to explain everything away. But, to me, the difficulty with that way of approaching it is just the sheer sum total of experiences that we hear about and that we know about from in our own experiences, to me, outweigh that argument and kind of make it seem silly. So it does come back to what you said a minute ago, that we are fighting against the inertia of the model of the world that we have inherited. And so how do we think that these individual experiences will make their way into this unfolding story? Will it be kind of a co-creative process where, and I kind of tend to think it will, that as the government, kind of peels back some of these layers and says, well, hey, there's now this and there's now that. Well, then that kind of gives permission to everyone to say, oh, I saw one of those and I had an experience kind of like that. And then that itself is a feedback mechanism that then the government's going, okay, now, people are cool with this. We can now unfold this layer of the story. So it is a very much a co-creative process. And I don't know that many people talk of disclosure in that way. We tend to think of it as very much like transactional. It's very one-sided. The government's going to do it. We're going to take it. And then, okay, great. Let's run with that new knowledge that we have received. I think the reality is and I would argue what we're actually seeing is that it is this relational, sort of unfolding of information, and it requires the participation of society just generally. And that's super important too in today's world, because there's a tremendous degree of distrust in government itself. So even if the government were to come out and say, hey, here you go, guys, here it all is on a silver platter, I can guarantee that our society would take to social media the next day and rip that thing to pieces. And so it kind of has to be this path where everyone's got some skin in the game. And what are the little sort of pieces and nuggets that can be shared that facilitate and catalyze the doors opening to these other stories and participation of the populace?
Yeah, several excellent points there. One of them being, and I agree with you, that we need to remember that in many ways government reflects society. It doesn't direct it, And when we think about social movements that have changed, that have eventually become enshrined in law, it's not because some lawmakers got together and said, hey, you know what, this is actually the way, this would be on the side of justice, so we'll just change the laws. No, you get years and years and years of a buildup of lobbying amongst a society till you have a majority of people, or at least the most influential people, agree that actually is good and right and just. Then the laws change. We need to remember that. And so I think that's an excellent point, that already disclosure is happening, but it's happening one conversation at a time, right? Mm. One person to another, across generations. And like you say, every time a conversation's had, and we salute the brave people who have the conversations, even when they're rejected for it, even when their mental health is called into question for it. Every time we do that, it's like another anchor point into this being real. And that slowly takes away from the stigma. It slowly bases it in reality for people. And at some point, it shifts into the majority, where people go, like you said, everyone gets to the point where they go, I either had an experience or I know someone that did, that's not explainable by one of these traditional means. So that part's important to remember. And we need to remember that recently it's become clear in the research I've done, certainly, that a lot of the people, even in these intelligence community circles, are experiencers themselves. Mm-hmm. So it's not like they're trying to hold back this truth or don't believe it. Many of them have personal experience. You could even argue, going big picture here, meta perspective, that perhaps even the phenomenon, the intelligence behind the phenomenon, or some of them, are placing people that are experiencers within those places of power and influence to slowly shift the tide, right? Because maybe the intelligence behind the phenomenon is aware that a sudden disclosure would not be good. We haven't even talked about this, right? The piece about how much does the phenomenon, the intelligence behind the phenomenon, play a role in disclosure? Because some people would rightly argue, listen, if they wanted to, they could make capital D disclosure happen tomorrow, land on the White House lawn, right? So maybe there's some, calculation going on there that again, some people will look at that and go, that looks devious and deceptive to me. I can't make any goodness out of that. Other people might say, no, that actually is a rational and caring way to respond to not completely destabilize a civilization in one go. So there's that piece too. But you make an excellent point also that for many people, disclosure is about personal vindication, right? That they have had experiences, or they know someone that did, maybe a family member, maybe a parent, a grandparent that really suffered and died without ever getting disclosure, and they feel like they want to avenge those people, right? And when you've been told that you're either crazy or you're making stuff up, then yeah, you can understand why people would want some authority to come forward and say, no, this is real. This really happens. This is part of reality. This is real life. Because then suddenly, not only do they have vindication amongst their family and friends, but some of these people are still questioning their own mental health. Some of these people are still questioning, how moored to reality are they if they've had these experiences or continue to have them. So they want some sort of context, right? They have these outlier experiences that they don't know where to put them, right? They don't fit with any of our conventional narrative. You wake up in the forest outside your house and you don't know how you got there, and your clothes are put on backwards. I mean, stuff like that. How do you make sense of that? There is no consensus narrative right now that says, oh, that's a case of this. So these people want some sort of contextual grounding to make sense of it for themselves, for their own mental health, for their own closure. That's another word we could use, but instead of disclosure, it's closure, some closure to say, aha, this is as much part of reality as me having, bran flakes for breakfast, So yeah, the personal piece is important. And I think many of the people we know in our circles that are kind of really obsessed with this topic are in it because there is a personal angle for sure.
Yeah, you've hit directly on the stakes. What are the stakes here at play, and the delicate nature in which this topic has to be handled, just broadly. And I think too that there's no. We really like this romantic notion that there is one party that has all of the right answers here and that can just sort of make it known. But the reality seems to be that it is very much a collective, it will be a collective disclosure. It will be a collective unfolding, that there are the very highly personal elements of this. There are the community elements, the global elements, and the geopolitical elements. I mean, sort of, jokingly, I can talk about, well, we get disclosure tomorrow, and think of all the new bureaucracy we're going to have. I got to file this paperwork to interact with this being, or whatever it may be. Take these things to a crazy conclusion, but nevertheless, we're talking about increased levels of complexity in our understanding of reality itself, and that not only affects the here and now, it affects our future. It affects our future as a species on this planet. It affects our past, how we interpret the events of our lives, and what we may have written off as something completely mundane and prosaic, that a dream we had years ago. And if that is somehow part of what this really is, well, now I have to take that, I have to pull it out of that drawer and go, okay, what does this now mean? What does this mean for me in the here and now and going forward? These are huge questions. And I don't think that folks have necessarily grappled with the way in which this topic has tendrils that reach into sort of every single facet of our psyche and our society. It's as tectonic as it gets. And I would hope that wherever we're going with this, that the others, whoever they may be, I would lean on them, and I would do so hesitantly as well, I might add, to be a partner in helping us navigate this. And I will say this on that topic. I very much, and I've said this on other shows, I struggle with this notion of asymmetric, sort of information here, and ability, right? So if the others have a greater mastery over, reality, or have obviously greater knowledge of what we would consider to be science, or all of these things, there's an information disparity. I think we could at least say that much. Then whenever there is an interaction with them, what is it that we can look to as some sort of means of saying, okay, I can trust whatever this is. I can have, I can, whatever it's telling me or explaining to me, I can have some degree of trust and fidelity that this is good. This is valuable. I don't know the answer to that. I'm not quite sure I understand how we would go about figuring that out. We'd like to think, and a lot of our science fiction, at least on the Star Trek side, for the most part, sort of talks about these, this collective of lots of different entities, and they're kind of working together. I mean, this is a very, the sense of cooperation is very attractive. So we'd like to kind of hope that's the way that it is. But I mean, we have no idea. We have no idea that that's the way it will be. And so I struggle with not only the ways in which disclosure will rewrite our personal stories, but the way in which we will relate as a species, just generally, with whatever this new reality becomes for us.
Yeah, when you were describing that process, I was thinking about when you use the expression tectonic. It absolutely is, and I was reminded of a video I remember seeing last year of this. These people were driving through the forest, and there had been a lot of rain that week. There's an insane amount of rain. And suddenly, one by one, these massive, pine trees, that were soaring into the sky just started falling one after another, onto the road. And
Wow.
and that's what I would use that kind of as an analogy for what this is like. These aspects of reality and society that we've trusted are solid and pillars of, trust kind of thing that we just take for granted, that this is the way the world is. This is the way life works. This is reality. That if the implications suddenly make those pillars start falling, like those pine trees on that road in the forest, is your view of disclosure the same? Like, I really want people to wrestle with that. Just think about the toll that would play. What would that look like for people's lives? Because if you care about people and the challenge it already is for so many people just to make it through the world, what would that added implication bring? A lot of people kind of have this kind of love and light perspective, which I understand from one point of view, that this intelligence has technology that could help us resolve global warming, that could get us off the petroleum economy, that could, give us better solutions than capitalism, all these things that seem like really pressing matters, that it's frustrating to some people, and some people shake their fists at these others and say, look, we need a hand here. Why don't you step in now? Mm-hmm. But I think, again, you have to ask yourself, what might make them not step in right now the way you're thinking? Like, don't assume you have all of the necessary elements in mind to decide whether or not that's a justifiable action. Perhaps you don't. And what might those other ones look like? For me, again, I'm convinced that this is a complete rewriting of reality, full stop, that I think I'm not, naive about what it would mean if this came out quickly in a sudden way. It would not be good.
Mm-hmm.
So, and then there's, when you talk about Star Trek and that kind of cooperative kind of, interspecies kind of communication, that again assumes that we have the basic construct of reality correct, and it's
Mm-hmm.
just some group that's maybe nicer, kinder, has some cooler tech. That's all we think about. And that
Right.
I think is incredibly naive. I think it's much more complex. Even the movie Arrival that we've talked about several times now, where they had to wrestle with their experience of reality and time was completely different. I still don't think that even gets to 10% of what's involved here based on what I've researched. So, uh, you know, again, when you think about just how, like you said, the tendrils go so deep, these are the roots of these massive pillars of trees that make up our civilization. When those are going to necessarily fall because of these revelations, it really makes you think twice about how this is done and how you could do this in anything quicker than a multi-generational kind of shift.
Mm-hmm.
So whereas some people think that the others hanging back looks like bad news to them, that they have a hard time wrapping their head around how that's a good thing, I can certainly conceive of why that would be the loving, responsible, more mature thing to do. Again, I want to make the disclaimer. I think there's numerous groups with different origins and different agendas, different developmental levels. But I'm saying at least as a notion, I can understand why that would be justifiable.
Mm-hmm.
Because absolutely going from the personal into the more global and geopolitical, the ramifications are immense and far reaching. And, as we've said before in the show, there are different developmental levels around the world, and what this revelation means, even to, like you said, even if disclosure came out tomorrow in American culture, one
Mm-hmm.
country, at one period of time, some people will be like, that's fake news. Like
Right.
some people will just say, it's from the government, so I don't trust it. What are they really trying to cover up? Um, so you have several developmental levels even within our one country. And then you think about different countries around the world, some are at the warlord level kind of thing, and it's incredibly complex to think about how this would be handled. And I think it's naive to assume anything else.
Yeah, agree. And as we kind of turn our attention toward the end of the episode, I want to come back to this too that I've touched on before, and that's that regardless of what may come, regardless of what additional truths we may learn, I'm reminded that we will still have the task of living with ourselves. We will still have the work that we have to do in our own lives with those who are in our orbit, and the importance of taking care of oneself generally. And I think there's a tendency that I see in some circles to kind of place a lot of one's hopes and fears and promise, on disclosure with a capital D. That this will be some kind of, in this process of revelation, there'll be essentially this salvation that takes place, that my problems will be solved. And I would challenge people who may come at it from that perspective to not delay the work that you need to do now. Do not put it off to tomorrow. And that's as much a message for me as anyone, that we all have things in our daily lives that we have to work on. And I can't answer what those are for anyone. We have to come face to face with those aspects of ourselves that do need work, and put in the work to getting there. Because regardless of what happens, I still gotta fix that. And I was wondering, kind of how you think about that. Obviously, we've already touched on the way in which the revelation of truths, no matter what they may be, have a destabilizing effect and will have a destabilizing effect on us. But what are some things that you personally would suggest or recommend that are things we could do right now, no matter how long this process may take, that we would all be better served to observe?
Well, I think, one thing that I'd encourage people to do, and I'm thankful that we get a chance to be a part of this, and the work I've done with Point of Convergence has been part of this too, and it's been very gratifying to see how just giving voice to these experiences, to these events, and saying yes, they're real. This is somehow part of the big picture of what it means to experience reality. It's been gratifying to see how that feels like people are told your experience is real. You're not lying. You're not making it up. You're not unstable. There really are anomalous events that happen. It's happened throughout human history. We've had different ways of framing it, but they continue to happen. In some cultures and at some periods of time, you're more rejected and ostracized than others for having those experiences, just for having them. But we're here to support those people. We really hope that liminal frames can be, as well as your show with CAB and with Point of Convergence, we hope these can all be places where you feel like you're a part of a community that accepts you, that believes you, that is right alongside you trying to make sense of all this. I would say that for sure. If you're surrounded by people who want to make fun of you and belittle you for your experience, we encourage you to reach out to us, reach out to other people, and find community that can support you, because that's essential for anyone going through this stuff. I would also say that as much as I think the implications are tectonic to our very fabric of reality, I personally am not overwhelmed by that. I think it's important to point out. I think some people might come away going, wow, this sounds like it's going to tear apart, everything, like the implications go that deep. And that's not what I'm saying. I think that there are ways to conceive of this, the implications, but still have a positive outlook. And I do. So I want to encourage people with that too, that it's while I think it's much too simplistic to say it's all love and light or it's all demons, I think it's a complex picture, but we still are part of a interconnected fabric of reality where everything ultimately is connected, even these others, in the different sources they come from. And I use that as a rubric to sort of make sense of what's going on as well. They have some of their own evolution they're going through, just like we do. So to bring it back to what you said, yes, we still need to do our work as individuals, as families, as communities, and as a civilization. We need to still keep moving forward. The what's on our table in terms of the issues we're trying to deal with, the growth we're trying to arrive at, all of that's just as important whether a disclosure happens tomorrow or not.
Couldn't agree more, and it's incredibly affirming, and I would echo what you said. I think that I'm hopeful that the ultimate truth here will feel affirming for everyone, because I think at its root level validates lived experience, and there's nothing better than that, than saying what you have experienced has value, has meaning, you matter. And, I think that we can't ignore that is part of this desire for this grander truth is, how does my life play into this grander story? Does my life have significance? Does it mean something? And I would argue, and I know you would as well, that the answer is an overwhelming yes. And that whatever this may be, that it will add greater color and clarity and beauty to that desire. And that's something that I very much look forward to. We do this show because, we enjoy talking with each other. It means a lot to, I think, each of us to be able to do this and to have this connection. But we do it also to connect with all of you. And we want to hear from you. We love hearing from you. And we will be doing future shows around things that you're interested in. So we really encourage you, the listener, to reach out to us, get in touch with us via all the channels where you can find us. You can find Liminal Frames on YouTube at the ExoAcademian YouTube channel. You can find Liminal Frames on Twitter. You can find myself on Twitter at AwaifSoul and Exo at ExoAcademian. Our DMs are open, and we do engage. We very much enjoy, kind of the back and forth, and our conversation is made better because of your participation. And so we look forward to the next chat, and we'll see you in a couple weeks, right, Exo? So you're on the alternating schedule now with Point of Convergence.
Yeah, absolutely. Point of Convergence airs every second week, and the in-between weeks, Liminal Frames airs. So people will find that this episode gets uploaded on Saturday, becomes publicly available Saturday evenings Eastern time in the U.S., and that will continue to be the case. That every second Saturday evening, you can find a new episode of Liminal Frames.
Excellent. Well, thanks again for listening, and now we will close. May the quality of our questions, shaped by a desire for understanding, enhance our journey of discovery. And may our travels broaden the sphere of our consciousness, reminding us that new discoveries beget new horizons. As always, adventure awaits. We'll see you next time on Liminal Frames.